Hi folks, this is slightly different for a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, the knife you're looking at the moment, this third pattern Fairbairn Sykes Commando knife, is not necessarily very special, and more importantly, it's not the sort of thing you would normally see on my site. I'm showing you it because this knife is slightly special to me. I don't think it's ever, in fact I'm certain it's never killed anybody or done anything horrid like that, but it does still have a bit of history to it. This was given to me, not so very long ago, maybe 5 or maybe 10 years ago, something like that, by my grandfather. He'd gone into a home, and when he went into the home, he gave me some swords. I collect swords, collected swords really before I collected knives. 3 swords he gave me. They were all interesting in a way. 2 were Victorian 1895 and 1895/7 Victorian ciphered infantry swords. They're interesting simply because one of them is quite limited in its time range that it was in service, the 1895 to 1897, because it was quickly updated, and the other because between 1897 and 1901 when Victoria died. So they were in relatively short time windows, whereas a Queen Elizabeth II one, as I also have one of those, she's been on the throne since 1952, so there are an awful lot of those around as a result. Plus, George V ones are quite common because the First World War, every officer who was commissioned got one. So a lot of families have one hanging on a wall somewhere. But anyway, he gave me those 2, and he gave me a very interesting Japanese katana, which he thought was just a sort of munitions grade war sword. And actually it turns out that although it was in fact only made in 1936, it was made by a guy called Amada Sadayoshi. And Amada Sadayoshi died in April the following year, only 37 years old. But he was a very significant maker of swords. And his son, Amada Akitsugu, went on to become what they call a national living treasure. In other words, it's the highest award that an artist, in this case a sword maker, can achieve in Japan. He unfortunately died a couple of years back, which is a shame because I always harboured a wish to go and meet him, because he still worked in Nihonto in Nagata in Japan, and it would have been nice to meet him. There's a lot of mysticism around these things. He used to draw all his water in January, because January was the most auspicious time to draw water for making swords, and he would make his own tamahagani steel and so on. So it would have been interesting to have gone and met him and taken him his father's sword to see. Amada Sadayoshi, the one who made my sword, is most famous for the fact that he made Yamamoto's sword. Yamamoto Isoroku was the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor, although in fact he was very much opposed to the idea of Pearl Harbor. He thought attacking America was a very bad idea, and it turned out to be completely correct. But anyway, he made a sword for Yamamoto, which was commissioned by a guy called Watanabe, who was a newspaperman. And maybe one day I'll do a video on those, because some people might find that interesting. I don't know, you're probably bored to tears already. But what's this knife got to do with any of that? Well, my grandfather, as you'll gather from him picking up that sword and bringing it back, served in the Far East towards the end of the war. He actually was a very, very interesting man. He left school in 1938, and his parents got him a job in an insurance broker's, and he absolutely hated it. So one day he just walked out, and he was in a pub. Now bear in mind he's only 17 at this point, but he met a guy who ran a territorial army centre, and he recruited him and said, "Why don't you come along to us?" And he decided during that time what he wanted to do was to join the RAF and become a pilot. He was a very independent chap. He'd done in his youth. He bought a bicycle and a tent, and he just went off backpacking for weeks and an end, staying on he'd stay on a farm. He'd pitch up one late in the day, and he'd say to the farmer, "Don't mind if I pitch my tent in one of your fields?" And in those days, they would have said yes, because it was relatively uncommon. You weren't plagued with travellers or anything in those days. And he would then get up early in the morning. He'd always been an early riser. He would do some work for the farmer, and he might get a couple of eggs or some milk or some bread or whatever, just to keep him going. And then he would travel on and go somewhere else. And he did a lot of this. So anyway, when he was at the Territorial Army, they asked him to go to Germany. And this was in the winter of 38-39, so before the war started. And he was taken over by a Church of England minister, a vicar. I'm in Scotland, they're ministers. Down there, they're vicars. And he took him over to England, over to Germany, and he set off walking with a backpack, no tent in this case, and he went and joined the Hitler Youth. Now, you could do that in those days. The Hitler Youth were very fond of British people. They thought the Britons were great. So he joined the Hitler Youth, and he got his membership card, which he still had in his latter years. And he went and he stayed at all of the Hitler Youth hostels. And you think, oh God, my grandfather was a Nazi. No, my grandfather was not a Nazi. Quite the opposite. He actually went round and he would go to arms factories and munitions factories and so forth, and he would paint them because he was a very good watercolour painter. And then he went to the British Embassy in Vienna, and he handed over all his pictures and had them sent back to Britain. Then he went back into Germany and he walked again, and then he went to the embassy in what was then Czechoslovakia, British Embassy, and handed over some more pictures, and they were sent back. And then he walked to Hamburg, got on a ship and worked his passage back to England. Before he left, his father gave him a £5 note, which he sewed into the strap of his backpack. And when he got home, he still had it. In other words, he'd walked 2,000 miles across Germany over several months and in the winter, and spent not a single penny of money, which in itself is quite a thing. I could go on with this for a long, long time, but I'll not just now. I'll cut forward. He joined the RAF just before the outbreak of the war, and was trained and became a pilot. And his first posting was flying tugs that towed targets for anti-aircraft fire, and he didn't really like this. He thought this was a bit rubbish. He wanted to get on and fight the war. A bit of foolhardy thing to do in those days, of course, because losses in the RAF were very, very high. My other grandfather was in Bomber Command, and they lost almost 1 in 2 of their aircrew. But anyway, he wanted to fly, and he got to fly Catalinas. And the Catalinas were made famous by Jacques Cousteau, the diver. He used to fly around with one, and he'd land and he'd dive underneath. The guy who invented the aqualung. But anyway, he flew his Catalinas, and he was flying in the Mediterranean, and he saw an Italian submarine which dived. He flew over, he dropped his string of depth charges and sank the submarine. Then he saw the crew abandoning ship and popping up onto the surface. So he landed his Catalina on the sea in order to pick them up. He wasn't a man without honour. It's certainly true. Unfortunately, the sea was a bit rough, and it broke the back of the Catalina. Had to lift off, and unfortunately left the crew to their fate. But anyway, he got home, and the first thing he did was he was reprimanded for breaking the back of his Catalina, sent to Scotland with the Catalina to get it repaired, and while he was there, he was awarded the DFC, or Distinguished Flying Cross, for his action. So reprimand and a very high honour, both for the same action. He later got another DFC, but let's skip forward. And he ended up serving in the Far East towards the end of the war, after the war in Europe had ended. The group of soldiers known as the Chindits were working behind enemy lines in Burma, and his role towards the end of the war was to fly them in and out from behind enemy lines in seaplanes. And because they were told that if they fired a gun, they would bring the whole Japanese army down on top of them and it would be too dangerous, they were issued with these and trained in how to use them, I should point out. And this in itself is not actually a particularly interesting knife. It's what's known as the third pattern. I don't know if anybody knows the potted history of the Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife, but the British commandos wanted a knife to use they wanted to learn, hand-to-hand combat, and they commissioned these two guys, Fairbairn and Sykes, to commission a program of fighting, and as part of that they came up with a knife. The first knife was actually made by Wilkinson's sword. It has a checkered grip, an S-shaped guard, a really nice little ricasso, and some very nice stampings on it. It's a beautiful thing and probably cost a fortune to make. Then there was a second pattern which was slightly simplified, and then this third pattern which was churned out in thousands and thousands and thousands, I would imagine, by probably just about every foundry in Britain. It has a steel blade. The handle, I think, is actually bronze. It's got a nut screwed onto the top to retain a steel guard. The blades on these, contrary to what some people will tell you, they're not sharp. I mean, they're about as sharp as an Arthur Wright knife is today, I suppose. But they don't really have it sharp. But where they are sharp, and they are extremely sharp, is in the point. And the point is, well, you don't want to get on the wrong end of that. And these knives, some people did sharpen them, but there's no real benefit to it because they're not a cutting weapon, they're a stabbing weapon. And they are a weapon. There's no pretense of being a utility knife in this. This isn't like a survival knife or anything like that. This knife is designed to be inserted just below the ear into somebody's neck to kill them as quickly and silently as is humanly possible. That's what it's designed for. That's what it does. So it's a pretty gruesome thing. Now, when the war ended, Grandpa brought his back with him, and he stayed in the RAF. Funnily enough, he started flying. I don't know what the tugs would have been that he flew at the beginning of the war, but then Catalinas, Short Sunderlands. The last plane he ended up flying was the Vulcan V bomber. He tells a very interesting story of flying over the two US battle formations, each led by a carrier and one British one. And he was flying at, I can't remember what the height, he did tell me the height, but it was at the ceiling of the Vulcan and was above the height that anything could reach him. This is before the U2 incident, I should point out, when people believed that at a certain height you were invulnerable to all missile attacks and so forth. The Gary Powers U2, of course, was shot down at a very high level, but we didn't know that then. So he was there with two nuclear weapons on board and could position them anywhere within 4,000 or 5,000 miles, and nothing could touch him, or certainly so he believed at the time. That's where he ended his flying career in the 60s. He went on to be commander of the in Singapore, in one of the Changi Air Base in Singapore, and then came back to the UK, ending up in Whitehall and retiring as an Air Vice Marshal in 1975. His name, if you're interested, was Air Vice Marshal Desmond Ernest, always known as Ted Hawkins, DFC Star. He also had a CB, Companion of the Bath, and a CBE, Companion of the British Empire, as his medals, and they actually come before the DFC. They He also had 3 mentions in dispatches. Personally, I think the bravery medals are always going to be valuable. Sorry, there was a brief interruption there as somebody came to my door and my dog went berserk. Yeah, I was saying that I think the bravery medals, DFC, Distinguished Flying Cross, and 3 mentions in dispatches for gallantry. He's got his second DFC for flying a mission, which was 99% chance of not coming back, and he did come back, obviously, but much against everybody's expectation. It was he had to fly up north into the Arctic Circle, take some reconnaissance photographs, and then start flying back. And when he ran out of fuel, or when he was about to run out of fuel, he was supposed to radio back with his intel, leaving it to the very last minute, ditching in the sea and hoping somebody would recover him somewhere in the North Atlantic, just south of the Arctic Circle. As it happens, he managed to fly, saving as much fuel as was possible, and landed with vapour in his tanks back in Britain. But again, he got the DFC for that because it was one of those missions that he volunteered for, but they didn't really expect to come back, because the idea of being rescued out of the North Sea was, or the North Atlantic was, well, it wasn't going to happen. They would have died. Anyway, they did get back. So unfortunately, he died a couple of years ago. He was a great man. I really, really liked him. We got on very well together, and I miss him dearly. But this is one of the souvenirs that I have of him that he gave to me. As I say, it's not a special knife intrinsically, but its provenance means it's an exceptionally special knife to me. So, thank you for that. If that was of any interest to you, I have a lot more. My family's history with the RAF goes back to the First World War. My great-great-uncle Darcy, who started life flying planes for the Royal Flying Corps, was at the beginning of the RAF, one of the founders of the Caterpillar Club, flew air displays, air racing, the Schneider Trophy races. He was a winner of one of the races there, and he went through the Second World War. He was in charge of special weapons, bouncing bombs, tall boy, Grand Slam, and so forth. Retired as a Commodore, but his last Air Commodore, but his last log entry was flying a Gloucester Meteor jet. So he went from sort of canvas and wood planes to the jet age. So he's very interesting. I also have another grandfather who was in Bomber Command. Unfortunately, was killed in December 1943, but he was the youngest wing commander in the RAF ever. And that's a record that stands and will probably stand forever. Unfortunately, he was also the shortest lived commanding officer of 100 Squadron. I have a lot of information on him. I have all his papers and logs and so forth. Anyway, there we are. That's enough for today. Thank you very much. If you stuck with me, please feel free to like, subscribe, and if you do like this sort of thing, please put a comment, and I'll think about doing some more, maybe a bit more structured than this wandering waffle. But anyway, thank you for listening. Bye bye.